Little Nightmares is one of those games that's been perpetually sitting at the very top of my backlog ever since it was released. It's always seemed like extremely my thing. I bought it on sale forever ago, and so I've had absolutely no excuse for not getting to it, except to say that it's always been right at the top of the pile. It's been one of those games I keep looking at and thinking, yeah, I should play that. And it's only a few hours long. I'll do that just as soon as I've finished what I'm playing now. And then I sit down and play another 300 hours of Final Fantasy XIV, or a 12th playthrough of Dark Souls instead, and then a shiny new game catches my eye, and I've accidentally played 50 hours of Balatro when I could have been playing Little Nightmares instead. You know how it is. Well, better late than never, I suppose. Yeah, I finally played Little Nightmares in current year, and yeah, it was really good. And then I played the DLC and the sequel, and now I'm going to talk about it for this long, because no one's managed to stop me yet. Little Nightmares is a horror platformer game released in 2017 by Tarsier Studios, founded in 2004 and operating out of Sweden. The game is set on an enormous ship called the Maw, and you play as Six, a small girl in a raincoat trapped in an oversized and dangerous world. Little Nightmares is one of those horror games where you have no means of fighting back against the monsters stalking the game, and so your only options are to sneak around and run when you are detected. Throughout the game, you also have to solve environmental puzzles, find hidden collectibles, and run from plenty of terrifying creatures while trying to escape the Maw. Mechanically, this game is a 2.5D platformer, meaning it's a fully 3D game where you can move about the X, Y, and Z axes, but the entire game is presented from a side view, like you're looking at a diorama. The game has its fair share of difficult jumps, but for the most part, the game is more focused on stealth, avoiding obstacles, and figuring out how to navigate the environment. On a PS4 controller, the L2 button crouches, while the R2 button lets you grab onto anything in the environment so you can climb or carry things where necessary. You also have a lighter that can be lit with the push of the circle button, which is important because Little Nightmares features a lot of moments of darkness where you'll need to use your lighter to find your way around. Each level of the game focuses on a boss character stalking through it, who has to be approached in a different way. The first level, the prison, only briefly features the janitor, but also includes leeches that will kill you if they touch you, and eyes that will turn you to stone. Little Nightmares is a critically acclaimed game, and a game that has a die-hard fandom, but more than any other game I've talked about on this channel, aside from Fear and Hunger, I feel like this game is going to be one that either tastes like soap or cilantro, purely depending on who you are. If you look at the Steam achievements for the game, you can see that the most common achievement, which is just to finish the first and easiest level of the game, has almost exactly a 50% completion rate. That seems just about right to me. Little Nightmares is a difficult and at times frustrating game, so it makes sense that it loses a lot of people as soon as they get their hands on it. I'll level with you now. While I really like this game, I'm also pretty bad at it. The side perspective messes with my depth perception, which often leads to me falling to my death or getting caught because I couldn't quite tell just how close one of the enemies stalking the halls was. Little Nightmares makes an interesting point of comparison to Little Big Planet, the popular level editor platformer that debuted on the PS3 for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that both games are presented as 2.5D platformers, which operate from a side view, but handle it in different ways. The second is Tarsier Studios' history with the Little Big Planet franchise. Media Molecule, creators of Little Big Planet, went on to develop a sequel. DLC for the first game was handled by some other guys. After Little Big Planet 2, the franchise was largely developed by a handful of other studios, while Media Molecule stayed on in a support role. Some other guys made DLC and a PS Vita version and a kart racer. Media Molecule instead worked on Tearaway, a 3D platformer with a similar arts and crafts aesthetic intended to be one of the PS Vita's killer apps. After Tearaway came out, Media Molecule co-developed a PS4 port of the game with some other guys, but primarily went on to spend over half a decade in development hell on Dreams, which is a story for another time. So, why am I talking about this? Well, Tarsier Studios were the other guys. Okay, they weren't the only ones making DLC content and ports for Little Big Planet, but take a look at Tarsier's output before Little Nightmares, and it's almost exclusively Media Molecule related content. They were one of a few studios responsible for Little Big Planet 1 DLC, along with Fireproof Games, who went on to make the Room series, and Supermassive Games, who went on to make Until Dawn and the Dark Pictures anthology. They also worked on Little Big Planet 2 DLC. They were one of 3 studios who co-developed that Little Big Planet PS Vita port. They were a support studio on Little Big Planet 3, and they are the other studio, aside from Media Molecule, credited as co-developing Tearaway Unfolded, the PS4 port of Tearaway. The only thing they released before Little Nightmares that was not somehow connected to Media Molecule is Ragdoll Kung Fu Fists of Plastic, the PS3 port of a game that is only notable for being the first game ever made available on Steam that wasn't made by Valve. Also, they made a PSVR game called Static that was released 4 days before Little Nightmares, so that is technically a precursor to it, I suppose. It's interesting then that Tarsier's first major release of an original game is also a 2.5D platformer, a fairly specific genre made up of only a few big names, and that it tackles 2.5D in a slightly different way from Little Big Planet. Little Big Planet, although still a 2.5D platformer, does not have a fully unlocked Z-axis. Instead, the game has 3 layers, 3 planes, that the player can swap between. It's basically 3 2D platformers layered on top of each other at all times, and in order to navigate a level, the player must swap between these 3 layers. I never played Little Big Planet 3, so if that one works differently, I'm only talking about the first 2 games here. Little Big Planet as a pure platformer is no Mario, but this has always been an interesting way of handling this 2.5D perspective. This multiple layers approach was most likely a limitation imposed on the game because of its focus on level editing tools. It's easier to tell a player that they have 3 planes to place an item on than to also make them gauge depth while placing items, but it does mean Little Big Planet doesn't struggle with depth perception issues or falling off of cliffs because you're holding the stick slightly too far forward or too far back while crossing a platform. Unlocking that Z-axis while keeping the side-scroller perspective introduces a lot of frustration to Little Nightmares, and purely as a platformer, I think Little Big Planet controls better. It's worth asking why Little Nightmares made this decision, however. I don't think Tarsier Studios are stupid or that they didn't playtest their game at all. I think they were well aware that the locked perspective but unlocked Z-axis made the game more difficult and frustrating, and so it's worth asking why they wanted the game to be at times difficult and frustrating. While Little Nightmares is mechanically similar to Little Big Planet, the games which Little Nightmares is the closest to stylistically are Playdead's Limbo from 2010 and Inside from 2016. Although Little Nightmares was in development when Inside was released, I think these are both clearly points of inspiration for the game. In fact, I'd argue that the Little Nightmares DLC gets a little too close to Inside at one point. Limbo and Inside are both games that are about playing as a small child in an unfriendly and dangerous world, and watching that child die over and over and over again. Limbo, in particular, plays with scale in a similar way to Little Nightmares, with the most famous parts of the game being the lengthy sections where you're being chased by a giant spider. I'm not sure if I'd call Limbo or Inside horror games exactly. Inside in particular feels like a darker Spielberg movie to me at points, but they are oppressive, demoralizing games about watching your child protagonist die horrible deaths over and over. In both Limbo and Inside, there are many moments where you end up dying because of things you were very unlikely to see until they'd already killed you once. Dying over and over again is part of the experience. They are unfair games by design, and that's not for everyone. Limbo and Inside are both strictly 2D games mechanically, though. You never have to worry about depth because there fundamentally isn't depth for your character. You are only moving along a single plane. Little Nightmares unlocks that z-axis, and the result is a game that is more difficult and more frustrating than either Limbo or Inside. That sounds like a criticism, but it's actually not. As opposed to Limbo or Inside, which are atmospheric and have scary moments, but I wouldn't exactly call them horror games, Little Nightmares is a horror game. It's a pretty common observation when talking about horror games, and survival horror games in particular, that the better the gameplay gets, the worse the horror becomes. Silent Hill, for example, 1, 2, and 3, are among the scariest games ever made, in my opinion, and they don't exactly control well, especially in combat. They're janky. They're clunky to control. That level of jank, however, is additive to the horror experience. The combat in Silent Hill 1 is extremely frustrating and unfair, and the result is that you really don't want to get into combat. That dread of having to engage with the game makes the threat of monsters more intimidating, and therefore makes the game scarier. I would struggle to say that Little Nightmares controls well as a platformer, in the same way I would struggle to say that Silent Hill 1 controls well as a 3D action game. The jump is imprecise and a bit floaty, depth perception is hampered by the perspective, and your character is slow and often hard to control. But the result of all of that jank and frustration is that the game is extremely tense. That tension is also added to by a pretty clever use of sound design and haptics. The sound design for Little Nightmares is excellent across the board, but of special note is that as an enemy gets closer to detecting you, you can hear Six's heart beat louder and louder. I was playing on a PS5 controller, and the game uses rumble in tandem with this sound design, which gets more and more intense as the enemy gets closer to detecting you. It's very clever and increases the tension even if you don't consciously realize it's happening in a given moment. There are moments when I think the game pushes frustration too far, though. The final encounter with the janitor pushes the game from tense to tedious, and there's one platforming puzzle in the DLC which requires extremely tight timing that the game simply doesn't support. For the most part, though, I think Little Nightmares plays how it should. It is mechanically solid. They hit the mark they were aiming for. That's not going to be for everyone, though, hence the 50% completion rate of the first level. What attracts most people to Little Nightmares is not the gameplay. The first thing that grabs your attention with Little Nightmares is its aesthetic. In terms of nailing a very particular art style that they were going for, it's hard to think of any game that's hit that quite as well as Little Nightmares does. The best point of comparison would be the films of Henry Selick, such as James and the Giant Peach, Coraline, and The Nightmare Before Christmas. The style gets compared to Tim Burton a lot, which I don't agree with because it really doesn't resemble Burton's aesthetic that much, aside from The Nightmare Before Christmas, which was based on a poem written by Burton and which Burton produced. It's not my intention to minimize Burton's involvement with it here. So I think what people are picking up on when they make that comparison is actually a resemblance to Selick's work. The film it actually reminds me of the most is 2009's Coraline, most of all because of Six's raincoat design. The comparison to Selick is no stretch, because he was actually at one point attached to a TV show adaptation of Little Nightmares, along with the Russo brothers. You know, the directors of the highest grossing movie of all time. And yes, I swear to God this is real and not a troll, because as recently as 2022, while doing the media rounds for Wendell and Wild, Selick mentioned to DiscussingFilm.net that he'd worked on it, saying, Yeah, I was involved with that. It's a really cool video game. It kind of just came and went. I don't know actually what happened to it. It's a really good story. I did a lot of work with a writer on that, and I can't really explain what happened. You can see this comparison the most in the character designs, both simple designs like Six's and the much more detailed enemies you face throughout the game. One interesting thing about Six's design is that aside from being much smaller than this world was designed for, she is much more realistically proportioned than most of the large adult characters we see throughout the game. Characters like the janitor or the chefs have proportions that are completely wrong, and are clearly wearing loose-fitting skin over whatever their actual faces are. The janitor, the major enemy chasing you throughout the second level of the game, is blind, and at a glance, it looks like this is because he's wearing a blindfold, but after looking closer, you realize that it's actually because the skin mask he's wearing is so loose-fitting that the skin has completely bunched up where his eyes should be, preventing him from seeing anything. You can occasionally see one of the chefs lift up their face slightly to scratch an itch under the mask. It is delightfully repulsive. It's also worth mentioning that Six's design, being the most brightly colored in the game, is also very helpful to the gameplay. While there are issues with the gameplay, one thing that works to its credit is that in the generally drab or dark setting of the Maw, Six wearing a bright yellow raincoat means it's never hard to tell where your character is. The eye is immediately drawn to her, which does make the game easier to read in its more chaotic moments. By contrast, Little Nightmares 2, which I generally like more than the first game, features the player character Mono, whose color palette fades into the rest of the drably colored game, and as a consequence, I think there are some moments where it becomes harder to read where your character is on screen during chase sequences. Recurring through the game are the gnomes, spelled without a G, characters that are non-hostile and are decidedly less repulsive than the monsters chasing us, but which still have a creepy look to them. I would describe the gnomes as garden gnomes made out of skin. I mean, more skin than a normal gnome would be made out of, I guess. The gnomes are harmless, but are scared of Six, with good reason, as we see near the end of the game, and will run away from her anytime you get close. The gnomes function as one of the game's collectibles. Many of them can be caught and hugged, and at the very end of the game, each gnome you have hugged will show up in the ending sequence to see Six off. We don't really learn what they are until the DLC, which I'll probably talk about on its own in a later video. The environment, like the characters, is also warped, corrupted, or constructed in a way that makes no sense. Bookshelves towering far beyond where anyone could feasibly reach, furniture bending at strange angles, or at one point a deep pit filled to the brim with old shoes. Spoilers ahead, by the way. This is your chance to jump off the video if you're concerned with that. The story of Little Nightmares is presented entirely visually. There are no words in either of the games. This story is told in obvious environmental storytelling ways, like seeing body bags hung from meat hooks in the kitchen, but also in more subtle ways. One of the best examples of this is how the whole game sways back and forth, both the camera angle and objects that are hanging or on wheels swaying with it. This reminds the player almost subconsciously that the whole thing is set on a giant ship. The theme of Little Nightmares is hunger. In fact, Hunger was the original working title of the game while in development, though it was changed before release. The game explores hunger in two primary ways: the hunger of Six and the captured characters like her, and the hunger of the guests, the swollen monsters who have come to the Maw to mindlessly feed. As the game goes on, you are interrupted at several key moments by Six being hit with hunger pains. The children seem to be getting fed just enough to keep them alive, which is why Six quickly begins to succumb to starvation once she tries escaping. To contrast this, we have the guests, which seem to be who the maw was created for. The guests are gluttonous, swollen by overindulgence to the point where they're barely even able to keep moving. This aspect of the game is very clearly inspired by Studio Ghibli's Spirited Away. The whole game is really, but this part most of all. The guests also have a hunger, but they don't have the hunger needed to survive. They have an endless, bottomless appetite that can never be sated. The maw exists as their endless buffet, where they can sit and eat and eat and eat forever. Even the name of the ship, the Maw, evokes a mouth gluttonously consuming everything in front of it. Obviously, the game is contrasting these two things, a lower class being held captive and starving, and an upper class that have more than they could ever possibly use. The guests cannot even be satisfied with the endless food placed in front of them. During their level, even with plenty of food placed in front of them, the second they spot you, they will animalistically begin chasing after you. The food they have will never be enough if they know there is anything that is not theirs to eat. Before you see the guests, you end up in the kitchen, and it becomes pretty clear that among more mundane foods like fish and vegetables, the guests are being served people meat, both the pint-sized children like 6 being held as cattle, and the bodies of full-grown people the size of the larger adults we see in the game, as evidenced by the body bags being hung from hooks and stored in meat lockers. I think this stretch of the game, the 3rd and 4th levels, the kitchen and the guest area, are the strongest part of the game. Not only are they the most thematically cohesive, but I think they have the best environments, the best art, and just overall the best design. 6's hunger and the hunger of the guests are not exactly portrayed as two different things. Each time 6 is overtaken by hunger pains, she has to quickly find food, and each time the food she finds shows her giving into darker and darker impulses. The first time it hits, you are offered some bread by another child held captive in the maw. The second time, though, with no one around, you find some raw meat in a cage, and 6 mows down on it, which ends up getting her caught by the janitor. The third time, she catches and eats a live rat, and the fourth time, which calls back to the first, she's hit by hunger pains, and a kindly gnome sees her and offers her some food. Instead, she jumps the gnome and eats him. This culminates after the final boss fight, in the final moments of the game. The final boss fight is the Lady, the woman who seems to be in charge of the Maw and is responsible for its operations, and who also has psychic powers. 6 devours her, proving herself no different from the guests who sought to eat 6. After eating the Lady, 6 awakens or absorbs psychic powers from her, leading to the ending sequence where you walk down a hall towards freedom, killing and absorbing some sort of essence from each of the guests, while sinister music plays. The game ends with 6 reaching the light of day and freedom, but it certainly seems like she's some far worse evil now that's been let loose upon the world. It's an interesting way to end the game, certainly a downer of an ending. I like how the game frames hunger, a universal part of the human experience, no, the animal experience, as a corruptive force. There is no sating this hunger. The more you eat, the stronger the hunger gets, until you end up like the guests, or like 6 at the end. There's also the fact that a portrait can be found in the game of the Lady along with 4 identical figures. It's easy to read 6's name then as an implication that she was fated to be a successor to the Lady, who was 5. A very cynical reading of this ending is that it's basically saying everyone is the same. That if you were in the guest's position, you'd be just like them too, and that it's only power that separates the exploited from the exploiters. However, rather than that cynical reading of the ending, a fatalistic message that anyone who attains any kind of power or wealth will inevitably be consumed by greed, I read this as a fable. A warning to keep your hunger in check, not to mindlessly consume and consume and consume whatever is put in front of you, but to be more mindful, to control your hunger lest it control you. So yeah, I think the game's theme of hunger is well explored. Unfortunately, instead of focusing strictly on this theme of hunger, the game also deals with another theme, one of perception, and it is not as successful. A motif that comes up in Little Nightmares frequently is that of eyes. The children are being watched through a giant screen shaped like an eye, the janitor is blinded by the folds in his mask, there are eyes that beam out spotlights that turn you to stone if they see you, and the final boss of the game, the lady, is themed around mirrors and vanity. So it is a recurring theme in the game, but it doesn't feel like it's weaved into the game's design and narrative half as well as the theme of hunger is. With the hunger motif being so central, the themes of vanity and surveillance feel like chaff. To be honest, I probably wouldn't even mention it if it wasn't for the fact that the lady, the climax of the game, is so centered around this theme of perception. When you find her, she's broken all of the mirrors in her quarters, refusing to stare at her own reflection. You defeat her by finding the single intact mirror left, carrying it, and forcing her to look at her own reflection as she charges after you repeatedly. I don't really like this level, which basically consists only of the boss fight, because it feels so out of place with the rest of the game, and isn't that fun or interesting to play. Thematically speaking, why is this how the game ends? Not only is the last level very short and underwhelming from a gameplay perspective, it's also divorced from the primary theme of the game. Yes, the motif of eyes has always been present, but the game's story and the protagonist's failings are based around hunger, which makes the final boss of the game feel like a non sequitur, and that frustrates me. What's interesting is that a lot of these secondary themes, eyes, perception, surveillance, are what Little Nightmares 2 is about. If it wasn't for the game ending with a fight against the lady, the other elements related to eyes and perception in the first game would be small enough that I'd chalk them up as pretty solid foreshadowing for the second game, but the climax of this game and this character's story should be more tied to a primary theme, not a secondary one. It doesn't ruin the game by any means, but between the final level being the weakest in the game and the lady feeling out of place with what the game has been about, it ends up muddling the climax of the game. Thankfully, that final sequence with 6 does redeem the ending somewhat, but it is unfortunate that the last level is the game's weakest. There's one more thing I want to mention about Little Nightmares 1 that I came across in my research and I hadn't heard about before. I mentioned earlier that Little Nightmares was Tarsier's first major release that wasn't DLC or porting someone else's game to another platform, but it wasn't the first original game they tried to develop. Tarsier was founded in 2004, and obviously they didn't end up making Little Big Planet DLC until it was released in 2008. We know what they were working on during that time, and if you're a Little Nightmares fan, I think it's super cool. This is the City of Metronome, a game which Tarsier Studios brought to E3 2005 with the intention of pitching it to publishers. The game was a 3D adventure game intended as an early next-gen title, which here means Xbox 360 and PS3, but they never found a publisher for it. It sounds like they created another demo in 2009, which I can't find any footage of, and that didn't go anywhere either, and so the project was ultimately cancelled. Sorting through the archived information about the City of Metronome, here's what I was able to glean about the game. The game is set in the, City of Metronome, a city that is fully controlled by the ominous corporation. The corporation runs the city by literally capturing children and siphoning their souls out of their bodies in order to fuel the machinery that keeps the city running. The children who have their souls taken end up as warped creatures called metronomes, with a silent G in the middle there. The primary enemies of the game were scouts, robots running off of the stolen souls that looked like old-timey cameras wearing Bobby uniforms. The game featured two protagonists, a young train engineer named Tin, or Ten depending on which source you're referring to. I think it's Tin though, and Nu, a young girl on the run from the corporation, who end up traveling through the dangerous city together to explore the corporation's secrets. The core gameplay gimmick of the City of Metronome was sound-based. Tin had a recorder that you would use to record sounds from around the environment, and could then play those sounds back at various pitches to have different effects on the environments. According to an archived article from AdventureGamers.com, which is the only article from the time I can find that actually tries to explain the game in any depth, this system could be used for things as simple as opening voice-activated locks, but could also be used to take control of other characters and various other strange effects. The article also mentions that Tarsier wanted to avoid lengthy cutscenes that explain the plot in detail, in favor of the player learning more information as they go and encounter more characters in the world, which sounds a lot like Little Nightmares' completely dialogueless approach to storytelling to me. The thing that's so striking about Metronome is how early Tarsier seemed to have their very distinct style so coherently figured out, and how many ideas that would later come to define the Little Nightmares franchise are so visible here. So much of this game looks extremely reminiscent of Little Nightmares, and especially the city of Little Nightmares 2. Metronomes were redesigned, but most definitely made their way into Little Nightmares 1 as the Gnomes, malicious and powerful adults ruling over a city, siphoning the souls out of children and leaving them as husks, is a major story beat in Little Nightmares 2. There are designs that look like they were taken directly into Little Nightmares, like the spindly armed man playing with a doll in the E3 2005 trailer, which looks very similar to the janitor from Little Nightmares 1. The idea of a young girl and boy traversing a dangerous city under sinister control of a powerful entity is basically the exact plot of Little Nightmares 2. According to the most reliable source on the internet, an unsighted statement on the City of Metronome's Wikipedia page, the photos in the suitcase Six wakes up in at the beginning of the first game show elements from Metronome, although I honestly can't make them out at all. It's easy to look at what we have about the City of Metronome and mourn for the cancelled game that might have been, but in this case, that's not really why I bring it up. Don't get me wrong, I think what we have of Metronome looks amazing, but the most interesting thing about Metronome to me is how even only looking at less than 2 minutes of footage and a handful of screenshots, it's so easy to see how coherent Tarsier's creative style as a studio was right off the bat, and to trace so many of these ideas to ones that were repurposed for Little Nightmares. We don't really need the City of Metronome because we kind of have it, and the version we got is a lot more timeless than the City of Metronome likely would have been. The City of Metronome was inspired by the kind of action-adventure games that were popular in the PS2 era, but that style of game was very much on its way out of fashion when they were working on it, and if they had found a publisher back then and the City of Metronome had made it to market, I think it would have wound up as a forgotten PS2 curiosity. Instead, while Tarsier were busy working as a support studio for a bunch of Media Molecule games, games like Limbo and Inside were released, and this very specific style of dark and brutal platformer ended up inspiring the game that Little Nightmares would become. Tarsier's skill set, honed by years of working on Little Big Planet content, resulted in a game that is not only stylistically captivating, but mechanically solid too. I'm ending this video here, but I played through the whole series as research for this video, so if you would like to hear more about the Secrets of the Maw DLC and Little Nightmares 2, please subscribe to see future videos, as I plan on covering both before Little Nightmares 3 releases next year. Meanwhile, if you hated this video and think I'm an idiot, please remember to leave a comment telling me to die. That engagement money still spends. If you liked this video, consider checking out my video covering Signalis, or my video covering the games of indie horror auteur Kira, like Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion and Lost in Vivo. Special thank you to my patrons and YouTube channel members who have pledged $5 a month to help me keep making videos like this one. Edward Clayton Andrews, Brandon C., Rules in Place, Mari SQZ, Raxarox, Mikaru X, Unhealthy Caillou, Sir Darkon, Rachel Aurelia, Young Sorcerer 23, Gassan Abanura, Patrizia Frabetti, Sninkelberg, Taylor Blair, Frondy, Yo-Yo Jojo Mojo, Tsai Voafehi, Dan Luther, Still Just Cow, Jose Armalas, William, Cabbage, Rekka, Alex Smith, Picayune, Hakan Boyam, Pete Lee, Knittind, Shiny Emptyhead, That's All, Alex, Bell Mage, and Malachi Murphy. If you'd like to get your name read out at the end of future videos, or get access to exclusive supporter-only videos, check out patreon.com/Zuldim, or click Join below the video. Until next time, take care, everyone.